Hello everybody, thanks for joining. We are going to start kind of on time as much as we can today. I can see that we've got more or less everybody that we're expecting. My name's Anna Hinchliffe. I'm one of the community propositions managers in the community team at the Co-op, and today's webinar is going to be hosted by Mick McGrath from Locality. And we've also got Stephen Thomas, Member Pioneer Manager, on the webinar as well to answer any Member Pioneer related questions. So we're here to, Stephen and I are here to represent the Co-op and to answer questions about Endangered Spaces campaign and anything that we're doing kind of more broadly. And Mick is the expert from Locality. So when we asked Member Pioneers what kind of information would be most useful to run on some of these webinars, one of the most popular things was around fundraising and being able to access the skills and resources that are available in the communities to help to bring people together, to help to signpost community groups to funding and resources that will be able to help them protect and save spaces. So that's what Mick's going to be going through today. We've also got some time for questions and answers. So if you want to pop some questions in the question box, we'll come to those through the course of the webinar. Anything that you want to add from your side, Steve?
No, thanks, Anna, other than to say hello to everybody, and obviously looking forward to tonight's a really important topic around fundraising, access and skills and resources. I've got a little bit of an update on some of the funding opportunities we talked about previously that the Co-op Foundations had to offer, but I'll give you those later on in the webinar.
Lovely, thank you. Over to you then, I think, Mick.
Great, thank you, and welcome to everyone again. I appear to have a sticky presentation, which is always what you want, isn't it? But anyway, well, there we go. So just a quick overview about those who perhaps haven't come across Locality before. We support local community organisations to unlock the power in their community to create a fairer society. Got over 700 members, really ranging in size from very, very small groups with no staff and very little resources to organisations which are multi-million-pound community businesses. So, you know, we cover very much the great and the good, but the thing they all have in common is that they really, really want to help their communities, which I guess is very similar to you and why you're here and involved with the Co-op Pioneers. So this is really going to be the agenda then. It's a canter through fundraising, what is out there, how do I find it, and how to write a good bid. It's also about accessing skills and resources, although that's very much, we'll do cover that towards the end. I'm making the assumption that the main groups you may be looking to support are small local community groups, which hopefully is the case, but the reality is I'll sort of talk about larger community groups as well, because that's probably the easiest way to do this. But as I say, the assumption is it's very much about small community groups. And as Anna said, please do pose your questions as you go along. We will have a break in between where we can go through those. So a bizarre holiday picture, this little place called Eyemouth, just north of Berwick, and when I was there were people, fishermen, who had a byproduct of fish heads and tails which were worthless, so they decided they in fact would have this as something where they can make some money by tourists coming along and feeding the seals. And actually this is a good example of you know, instead of lemons and making lemonade, where there's muck, there's brass. The point really is for projects to be successful and viable, community groups really need to have a range of income sources and a real enterprising approach, which again, I think this picture shows quite nicely. So in terms of income sources, there's a real mix. You know, the vast majority of community groups are very small, as I've said. They'll spend a few £100s and focus on specific activities, such as an annual community event, maybe a flower show, you know, that sort of thing, whatever it is. I'm sure you could think of your own examples. They're maybe unconstituted, and what that means is that they haven't really got terms of reference, they haven't got a bank account even. They just do what they do, and they possibly raised through tombolas or little things to raise the money they need, and then they do the activity and they don't do anything else. But equally, they may be constituted, so with the terms of reference bank account, and if they're really more established, they may be incorporated, which means they've set themselves up as a charity, as a charitably incorporated organisation, a community interest company, that sort of thing. So that shows the span of sort of community groups. But generally there is a lot more funding available for incorporated groups, such as charities, possibly because funders see less risk in them. So for example, I've been seeking funding for 2 constituted groups, and they can only access at best about 20% of the funding opportunities that an incorporated group can. So it's important for people to understand the amount of funding available will generally reflect how established the community groups are. So as you can see, there's a whole range of income sources out there, and again, I'm sure you're well aware of most of them. So fundraising events, for example, one of the things I was talking about last time was locally a community group have come together to try and save a community centre which the local authority possibly will shut down. So I've noticed they've put up adverts for disco they're having, and they're charging £5 for people to go along to show their support and so forth. But so that sort of approach is live and good, and obviously has lots of community benefits as well. Other types of examples: donations, sponsorship, subscriptions, contributions, bequeaths. Again, I was involved in a football tournament recently, and one of the people just went around all the local shops and managed to get about 30 different prizes, ranging from bottles of wine to whatever it was. And the point being, the shops were expecting people to come and ask for donations, and so they are available out there. Similarly, it's possible to get in-kind support from people. So for example, if you're involved in a project, let's say some kind of gardens, and you wanted to do some quite manual work, it may well be that if you know your local builder, they may lend you or sort of would do some sort of work for you, that sort of thing. Similarly, it's about partners who have similar agendas to you and will want to sort of get involved and help you. Then we can move on to talking about grants, which we will in more detail. Trading income, crowdfunding, again this is something I'll cover. Service level agreements or contracts, so that's generally for larger, more established community groups. And also loans, which is something which is becoming increasingly popular and needed. Okay, so let's talk about grants then. I guess it's important really to understand that grants really come and they go. Some have open windows, which means they're there open all the time. Others, this is more usually the case, they have strict deadlines. So it's really important to make sure you know and have access to funding advice. Otherwise, you miss really good opportunities, and I'm certainly experiencing that at the minute, where I've missed a few good opportunities because I wasn't aware of some funding opportunities, but equally I found some better ones as a result of being more clued in. So anyway, generally the rule is the smaller the grant, the less information is required by the funder. So yeah, that's important to say as well. So in terms of current funding examples, I'll just run through some lottery ones, partly because I still know a number of those well because I used to work for the lottery and I've still got some contacts there. But one of them is around, they're now called the National Lottery Community Fund, used to be called Big Lottery Fund. They have a small grants programme which is £300 up to £10,000. Application form, it's light touch. I think there's only 8 questions in it, and it has a success rate of about 60%, which is really high. When you're looking at success rates for some programs, it can literally be 5% even. So that's something to bear in mind, that sometimes it can be hard to get hold of the funding, but so it's important to think about your best chances of making it as you can. Anyhow, with Awards for All, it's about bringing people together to improve places and fulfill community potential, where you need to meet at least one of the criteria, but beneficiary involvement is key. So I suspect that's very similar to some of the community, the co-op funding, which Steve will talk about in a few minutes. So awards for all can be used for a whole really wide range of activities, and it's also important to say that the other lottery distributors, so Sport England, Arts Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund, also have their small grants programmes of up to £10,000 as well. Similarly, there are a whole range of charities. So for example, most county-wide areas have things called community foundations. There's 46 across the UK, and they either have their own funding programme. So for example, a number of community foundations have got funding through the tampon tax, and as a result there's funding there for girls and women's groups. So you know, it's important just to be aware of the wide breadth of funding out there. So Reaching Communities is another National Lottery Community Fund grant, except it's for £10,000 up to £500,000. Again, this is for the more established groups, and very often the funders will look for a trend of wanting to see small groups, possibly inexperienced groups, apply for the smaller grants from them before they go for the bigger grants. So you know, it's about demonstrating your capability. But what's also interesting, for example, with Reaching Communities, is that whilst you think you can apply for up to £500,000, the reality is they don't want to give you £500,000. At best it'll be £250,000 because of some of their funding challenges and demand and so forth. So again, this is why it's important to get some of that intelligence, because you won't necessarily pick that up through reading their documents just in themselves. So you know, do think about that. So Steve, at this moment, just give myself a quick breather. Are you happy to talk about the Co-op Fund and what the opportunities are with that?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to give a bit of an update as well on the Spaces to Connect funding, which closed in the sort of the second week of August, because I'm conscious that a number of the pioneers will have been advocating people apply for that fund where it was appropriate. If they may remember, there were two strands to it. One was Enhance, the other one was Explore. Across the two strands, we got almost 800 applications. A phenomenal response to that call out. The enhanced strand was for larger grants up to £50,000, and actually will be funding around 10 of those as a result of the applications we've received. And that was for sort of taking established projects onto the new level to extend their services or improve the facilities that they have on offer. The smaller grant fund was the Explore Fund, and there will be 60 of those grants being made, and they were grants up to £10,000. And this is for groups who are kind of newly forming to explore the opportunities they've got to sort of to take on a space or a building and to use that for community benefit. So that was kind of an update on the work that has been done to date. Those funds are obviously now closed and the awards are being considered for allocation. What we've got available at the moment is we've got an I Will Community Spaces Fund open, which is focusing on youth advocacy and improving community spaces for young people in particular. Now that fund will offer grants up to £35,000, and that closes on the 20th of September. So if people were aware of a project that might be appropriate for that, they will need to get a submission in fairly soon, with that closing date being sort of only just under 10 days away now. The only other funding that the foundation are offering at this stage, and will be offering for the foreseeable future, are interest-free loans. Those loans are up to £50,000, and they're to help organisations that run a community space for the benefit of the community sort of enhance the sustainability of that offer, to ensure its kind of long-term sustainability by looking to improve the facilities or extend the services or reach out to a new demographic or offer kind of new support to their community. So at the moment, we're looking at the I Will Community Spaces funding for youth advocacy and the interest-free loans for up to £50,000. And as I say, that interest-free loan offer is open for the foreseeable future with no immediate closing date on the horizon.
Great, thanks very much for that, Steve. That's wonderful. and I always like it when I don't have to do too much talking as well. Just moving on then, that's sort of been happening over the last couple of years. Increasingly, we're starting to see local lotteries being set up, and I know hospices and large charities have been setting their own lotteries for some time, but these are being set up largely locally, but administered by a national company, very often by local authorities in the lead. The way they work, groups request to be a good cause, and if they're accepted, they get money from ticket sales from those people who have stated them as their preferred good cause. It may only be providing a few £100s a year, but again, for a lot of small local groups, a few £100s is really, really useful to them and really important. So, it is an opportunity out there. I think there's certainly over 50 of these have been set up in the last say year or so. What's key really is to have a good profile, and you'll hear me say that a few times over the next short while. So in terms of what help is out there with bid writing, there's not necessarily the support there once was, but there's still places to go. So for example, a number of, they call them Council for Voluntary Services, CVS, may call them volunteer bureaus, that they have different names in different places, but a number of them still provide training on bid writing. Similarly, some local authorities will have staff who can support, advise and guide. So it's always worth asking if partners, colleagues that also maybe got a track record of bid writing or proofreading are there to help you sort of put your application together. Is it a science or is it a dark art? It's a bit of both, to be perfectly honest, in terms of how to write an application. In terms of most funders, they'll want to know the impact of their funding, what the difference is going to make, and part of that will be understanding issues around the community. So it's important to be able to get evidence from places, and the reality is you don't need to be a statistician. You can Google observatory as a term, and the odds are you'll start to come up with a site with a really wide range of local indicators. Funders will want to know why you want the funding, and so you need to be able to provide evidence as to what the issue is you are trying to address. So observatories can provide a lot of background information, evidence for your locality. These can include socio-economic, environmental and health data. Similarly, index of multiple deprivation, sorry, these sort of very jargonistic terms, but the index of multiple deprivation is updated, I think it's every 2 years, and it kind of ranks local authority areas 1 to 326, I think it is, with the 326 being the most deprived communities where there are a range of issues and sort of sticky problems which need to be addressed. Similarly, you get health observatories as well, and these allow you to target and mine for local information. So you'll see here I've got one which I use, Nottingham Insight, and it has loads and loads of information on there which is really useful for me when I'm looking to put applications together, and again provide some of the evidence base. And in terms of how do you find out about these grants, as I say, there's nothing more frustrating than seeing a really well suited funding pot but it's closed by a week. So there are places you can go. So for example, community groups can sign up to NCVO's Funding Central website where you can do searches, and that's free to very small charities, but there also may be local access to funding toolkits through local authorities or local CVSs, even if not in your area. Many of the grants are national, so with this example here, I've signed up to the Lincolnshire funding portal. I don't live in Lincolnshire, but this is very helpful for me because through this I get weekly updates. I can regularly update what kind of thing I'm interested in, so it filters out, because the reality is there are tens if not hundreds of funding programs out there at any one time, and as I say, they come and go. So this is a really useful way of being able to keep up to date, because the reality is there's no point doing loads of research if you're not going to apply for something for 3 or 4 months, because the possibility is that that funding opportunity would have closed by then. So you know, obviously I'm assuming most of the people dialing in, you know, you're not living in somewhere like Lincolnshire, but the reality is, I say I don't, and I can still sign on to it. So I'm sure there'd be no problems if you wanted to use that, if there isn't an open for community or similar portal in your area. So, you know, do use those, because the reality is 95% of the information are there in terms of grants. They're relevant to all other areas as well. So a little cheeky hint for you. So in terms of non-grant funding, the recognition and the reality is that grants are arguably the easiest way to access funding, but there are disadvantages such as very significant competition, sometimes a length of time to get a decision. Some of the programs you can be literally a year, that's in extreme cases where it's a problem. So you will need to also look at the sort of grant funding opportunities too. And I'll give you some examples. So for example, we have one called Soup. The idea came from America and it's becoming more and more common. Basically what happens is, and again, the focus is very much on some small local funding opportunities, but it's more about getting your story out to a sympathetic crowd and the indirect support they can bring, as well as honing the pitch and starting out. So just to explain what Soup is, basically you arrange with like-minded people to have a meeting. You then do a people pay £10 contribution, and as part of that they're fed soup and bread, and then some agreed people will pitch their ideas. You, the people that have come along with your £10 offer, then decide via a vote who gets the money, and then those sort of people are asked to go away, deliver what they want to do, come back to the next meeting to share what they did. It could be very easy to be cynical about this and sort of think, well, what's to stop someone running off with 100 quid? Well, in reality, nothing, but the experience is actually that doesn't happen, and you know, these are networks where people know each other anyway. So you know, it is a really nice way of fundraising. It's a really good way of groups kind of getting used to public speaking, getting used to being able to pitch their idea in a way which people understand, and it gives groups you know, confidence and new skills in order to try something. So yeah, do look up Soup. It's certainly in areas. Again, the example here is one from Nottingham that was done last year, and £195 was raised for that particular group to go away and deliver things. I won't dwell on this too long, and Steve did mention loans earlier on. The reality is loans tend to be for more established, larger groups who have been trading for a while and who have got a track record and built up sort of a trust level that people are going to be happy to lend. But you know, the reality is lots of groups get very scared by the idea of loans and think they would have to sell their house if they're defaulting and all sorts. That's not the case. Certainly shouldn't be the case. But you know, the reality is loans can grow in different ways. So for example, Big Invest certainly have had a loan scheme where you tell them, so for example, your community centre's lighting needs replacing, they organise for fitters to come in and provide all the equipment and do the fit out. You then, in theory, have much cheaper electricity bills because of the lighter bills coming down, and that loan can ideally then be repaid in the next sort of 5 or 10 years through those natural savings. So you know, loans, yes, can be scary, but don't necessarily need to be scary in that sense. Something else I'll just touch on briefly here as well is community shares. This is something which has really grown in the last few years. With community share offers, there's been over 300 share offers now, and they've raised approaching £100 million for community ventures such as pubs, community energy schemes, community shops, those sorts of things. So the Weird and the Wonderful has been funded through them, and again, it's about people who have got kind of a good business understanding, people who have kind of written up clear business plans and so forth. You know, it's something to think about. So loans are increasingly becoming an important aspect of the sort of funding opportunities, and less and less something to be frightened of. But as I say, it's one groups need a bit of hand-holding, confidence to move into. So I'll just talk briefly about crowdfunding. Again, this has become increasingly popular. There's a range of different providers with different terms and conditions. So, for example, Locality are involved with SpaceHive. SpaceHive say 52% of their funding campaigns are successful. That's higher than any other platform. I feel like I'm doing a plug here, but ignore that. It's about making places better. And we're recognising that this can be tricky, so they built a bunch of clever features to make life easier from verifying your project. So that's what Locality do. We just make sure it's sound and it's got everything in place. And with that, it then helps to attract different backers and to also get more people interested in it. SpaceHive grant makers back projects alongside crowdfunding. So, for example, you can attract pledges from your local authorities. So, near to me, Leicester City Council, for example, have a mayor's pot, which they use to match community groups who are doing a crowdfunding campaign as well as companies and other foundations. So, you know, again, it's something which is quite interesting and still growing. And some people are saying increasingly this is going to be one of the most important funding opportunities going into the 2020s. So I think I'll stop at that point. Steve or Anna, I don't know whether you've been looking to see whether there's any questions have been asked in the meantime.
Yep, I've been keeping an eye on things. There's no questions come through, but obviously, if anybody listening wants to ask a question, please feel free to do so at any time. I had a couple of questions, Mick, just on a few things you said, and I might be slightly out of touch, so apologies. But you're talking about where to source information from if you were looking for funding opportunities. Are things like the Directory of Social Change still available? Is that still a useful resource, or is that kind of outmoded now?
No, they are still there. I guess the Directory of Social Change quite often would be for the more established kind of groups, and it could be specifically about particular skills linked to the sort of community sector. But no, you're right. I mean, there are lots of different sources, and similarly, there's lots locally, which clearly you find out very often through starting to talk to people and even just Googling. It's amazing what comes up when you do sort of start digging there.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is when you were talking about sort of preparing your bid and looking at an evidence base, we have our own wellbeing index, which gives sort of a basket of 9 indicators about the well-being of particular communities. Do you think that kind of resource would be useful in people preparing sort of a case to tackle particular issues in their locality?
Yeah. I mean, for me, because I'm currently writing a number of applications, what you want to be able to do is find stuff as quickly as possible, and find stuff which isn't you saying, oh, we think there's, you know, some pretty dodgy things or tough things going on in our area. You know, funders are going to want to see there being a clear evidence base. So if it's not you saying, it's someone else, which is you know, tried and tested information, then you know, that makes a stronger approach. So yeah, I think soak it all up and find the stuff which is relevant to what you're looking to put an application in about.
Yeah, so I will put a plug out for the Wellbeing Index. I mean, it's based on 45 sort of different data sets. It's features 28,000 different sort of locales. You put in your postcode and you'll get a kind of defined community around where your project might be. So, and it gives a good overview of the sort of key issues that sort of comprise the sort of healthy and a community that's got a sort of good rating for well-being compared against the national average. So definitely worth a look if people are trying to identify what issues they might want to sort of tackle and looking for an evidence base. What's come through while we've been talking is there's a little bit of thank you from Donna. She sort of said the fantastic tips tonight for member pioneers, really valuable. So thanks for that, Mick. And then Paul's sort of given us a vote of encouragement. He helped helped on a space Hive crowdfunding in Crawley. And because of this, he's been asked to help other groups who were setting up in the area. And it really helps to build a network and raise the profile of the kind of work that can be done. So no questions as such, but definitely a vote of confidence in sort of the approach that you're outlining.
Great. Well, that's always reassuring and definitely good to know. Okay, so I will move on to a funding overview. This is personal. I should have said probably at the beginning, I spent nearly 12 years working for what was a big lottery fund. So I've been quite immersed in funding. I still find it interesting and a bit of a geek, I suppose. So these are just sort of personal views as things I've seen where people have done right, but also maybe where they've done wrong. So again, they're very much personal opinions. You may have different experiences, but with this then, so when applying for grants, I think it's important to do some really basic stuff. So the first one is, are you eligible and do you meet the criteria? I do quite a lot of assessing for Locality with some programs such as Bright Ideas Fund, which is one we're administering. And it's amazing how many people put in applications where they're neither eligible and they don't meet the criteria, and yet they spend hours and hours, possibly days, putting them together. It's a real kick in the teeth when you do that. So it is really quite simple to just check the eligibility, and quite a few funders actually have eligibility criteria which you have to sort of answer before you can go through, but lots don't. So yeah, just be mindful of that. Is it clear why the project is needed and the evidence sources? So again, we've heard some examples from some other people there talking about the importance of getting that good evidence base and finding that easily and from reputable sources. It's also about following your mission. So you should be doing a project which you want to do because you want to do it, not desperately trying to shoehorn your project into what the funder wants. Again, I've been trying to do that recently, and it takes a bit of discipline actually, because you'll see something and you'll think, well, yeah, that sounds right, but then I've found that's not to be the case. And where I've phoned up people actually from those funders, you get quite a different steer. So it is important to think whether your project fits or not, because if it doesn't and you're really struggling to convince yourself, you're not going to convince the person assessing it. And linked to that is very much this thing about think like the funder. For me, lots of people just say, well, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to do it, and they don't necessarily think from the funder's perspective, the person sitting there reading it. So it's important to just try and think from their perspective. Does it answer the questions they need to have answered? Is it interesting? Is it just sort of full of sort of jargon which they're reading day in, day out, every single day, and make it blur into just all the same sort of thing? So it's really important to try and do that just from that perspective. I think it makes friends, because if someone can read something and see it looks interesting, then they're more likely to support it. And following on from that point, make it stand out, get them excited, provide a good story to it, up-to-date case studies, social media. Presume they'll Google you. And again, for very small groups, I know you won't have websites or unlikely to, but lots of groups do have Facebook pages, and they can be really, really telling insights as to how active the group is, what kinds of activities it does, and it's really useful then if you've kind of got good case studies, lots of visuals to show what it is you're doing. It's really, really important to do that. Can you bring in support from other people? So it's important to have critical friends, people to look over the applications and break down the work. As I said, is it science or dark arts? It's both. So it can be quite difficult to sort of sometimes see beyond the wood for the tree. So yeah, I always think it's good to get other perspectives. And sort of really build on your social media presence as well. Just one other thought while I'm on, I was mentioning Awards for All earlier on. Awards for All assessors are expected to do up to 8 assessments a day. So if you're doing that, that's 40 odd a week. You're doing that and they all kind of read the same, and they're all kind of just throwing back the words which they're reading as part of the guidance. It makes it quite difficult for them to get inspired. So, you know, again, I've spoken to staff from Awards for All who say they're always looking for projects which are interesting, you know, just written in a nice, clear, concise story way with a beginning, a middle and an end. Makes it so much more enjoyable for them. And I suspect if they want to support you, then the odds are you're going to be more successful than if they're sort of really turned off by it. Ask for clarity if you're not sure, and read the guidance, research, and to sort of to show that. The reality is, when I worked for the lottery, I oversaw some research which showed that actually only a third of applicants actually read the guidance note. So that means 2/3 of them didn't, and that's where you start to make a lot of the very basic areas which make it very easy for the funders to reject you. And if you think back to what I was saying earlier on, that some funders are massively oversubscribed, unfortunately the assessors will be looking for reasons to knock back as many groups as they possibly can. It's a horrible thought, that, isn't it? But you know, that's the reality. So you know, it's important to kind of make sure you do read the guidance so you understand what it's about and you answer the questions properly. So also allow enough time and tap in resources. So, you know, the idea of trying not to leave it to the last minute, and, you know, I appreciate some of this reflects different personalities, and some people thrive working that sort of way, leaving it to the last minute. But I think it's better to start it, pause it, then think about things and sort of keep adding to it and developing it, and then asking others to sort of critique it as a way of progressing your idea. That generally, I think, makes it clear, because as I say, sometimes you can be so much into it that it makes perfect sense to you, but to someone coming to it cold, they would struggle with that. So, you know, it's something else to think about. Network with funders. Funders don't do the briefings and funding fairs and so forth as much as they used to, but you know, it's still important to kind of get into the right network, so where briefings, that sort of thing, do happen, that you can go along. Similarly, some funders locally, you know, will have staff, and I think it's important to try and build a bit of relationship with them, you know, be able to pick up the phone, and because the odds are people who get into funding generally, from my experience, tend to be people who want to help create better communities and so forth. So, you know, they are there to try and do the right thing rather than looking to trip you up. So, you know, it's important to try and develop relationships where you can. But of course, with lots of them, you can't. It's very much automated. But as I say, lots of them do have opportunities to email and so forth and get the information you need. Also, it's important to think about, are you in the right partnerships, and do you make time for the networking? So again, a lot of information I pick up is through talking to people, and you know, gossiping sometimes, having a coffee or whatever, and that way you find out what's going on. But occasionally, sometimes funders will also tell you where things are going quite badly wrong, and indeed sometimes where they're short on applications, and that does happen on occasions for you know, different reasons. So you know, it's kind of good to try and be out there and find out from those in the know, and get the knowledge from them. And similarly, do you have any plans for match funding requirements? Certainly some funders will require you to have match funds, so you know, it may be that they'll be expecting you to get half the money from other sources. So you know, it's important to think how you can do that. And match funding doesn't always necessarily have to be cash, it can be in kind. So for example, it could be volunteers doing particular activities. It can be local businesses coming along and lending you equipment or whatever. So, you know, that sort of in kind can go lots of different ways. Okay, have you got a good, robust and accessible business plan? Now, business plans all sounds very scary, particularly if you're a small group, you know, or even just maybe 1 or 2 staff members. But the reality is, if you're a very, very micro small community group, you don't need a business plan. You just need to have some clear ideas about what you're doing. You know, there are sort of templates that you can use out there. So one I use with groups quite often is a visioning document, where I just go through it, and it's just on one page, where you sort of say, well, what is your vision? What is the headline thing you're here to do? Then what's your mission? So give me a little bit more detail about how you're going to do what your vision is, and then what your aims are, and then what your objectives are. So through that, you in effect do have a business plan anyway, because it kind of sort of shows you what you're looking to do, at least sort of head starters. So you know, that's a good and important approach to sort of think about having a clear direction no matter your size. It's also important to demonstrate good governance, so to show that your organisation is credible, and that what you're doing is right. So for example, if you are a charity and you're on Charity Commission website, they'll, if you're consistently late in putting in your accounts, audit accounts, or just general accounts, that becomes a mark against you with some funders. It will become a question mark as to why you don't appear to be run effectively and smoothly. So it's really important to make sure that the funders, because they'll all Google you, they'll all try to find out about you. It's important for you to be able to sort of show that actually you're a well-run, credible organisation, rather than thinking, well, I'll get around to putting the accounts in at some point. But as I say, it is something you have to be careful about. When you're putting an application together, it's important to accurately reflect the costs of the project as well. You'd be amazed by how many people get the figures wrong, as in they don't add up, or they have quite unrealistic assumptions, possibly because they think that's what the funder wants to hear. So for example, some will say, oh, we expect there will be 20,000 beneficiaries for our flower arranging group. Well, patently that's not true. So you know, it's just be realistic about things. In reality, if it's a small niche group but it's having an important impact, you know, that's okay. Funders don't want to see you just telling porkies, because you know there's just no need to do that. It won't help you in that sense. It's also important to be clear on common reject reasons as well. I mean, the reality is, if there is high demand, funders will be looking for reasons to knock back projects, and so will throw out applications for simple mistakes. Funders can certainly smell the desperation sometimes as well. So you know, it's about, as I say, telling an interesting story, and you know, thinking about it like that. Okay. Yep, so some of the examples of common reject reasons are not applying to the right program. So as I said before, that's trying to shoehorn in. It's poorly planned. There's no clear evidence of what the money will be spent on, and it doesn't demonstrate fit with criteria. So, you know, again, funders will quite often say you have to meet at least one of the following kind of criteria. So, you know, it's important to be able to spend a bit of time thinking about that creative link between the two. Okay, so for me, it's about sometimes treat it like a job application, make it memorable, make it stick out. That point I made about awards for all assessors and their boredom threshold. Ask for what you need, not what you think the funder wants to give. Again, I've come across this lots of times where groups are almost scared to ask for what actually they need, because the reality is various things will happen there. Either at best you're going to be short, at worst you're not going to be able to deliver your project, and then when the funder is asking for you know, evidence, information, you won't be able to sort of show that you've been able to sort of deliver the project which you asked for the money for. So you know, it's really important to ask for what you want. That said, funders, particularly where they're oversubscribed, and I gave that Reaching Communities example, will sometimes squeeze down the amount of money. So again, this is where, particularly on larger grants, it's important to do your intelligence to find out what you can likely squeeze, and what the funders are likely to go for. So also think about yeah, you use the guidance support theme. So for example, the community fund have documents on identifying need, information checks, aims and outcomes, because you know, for example, lots of people aren't going to know in detail what aims and outcomes are. And I know when I used to work for them, they'd talk about smart outcomes and all sorts. And yes, it's useful, but it's also a very good way of confusing lots of people. So you know, give yourself the best possible chance by, if they're using sort of terms like that, then make sure you're kind of meeting them in the way that you go there. I also think it's really important not to take it personally. I mean, I said earlier about you know, think of it like a job application. It's easy to take that person if you're rejected, isn't it? But the reality is, I know lots of really good bid writers who kind of go on a ratio one successful bid to every 5 applications they put in. So, you know, the reality is, particularly when you're starting out, it's hard. You'll learn as you go along, but yeah, it can take quite a while sometimes before you actually start to see some of those come in. So there has been a canter through, but in terms of summary about the funding, I think it's important to say once you have the funding, that's only the beginning of the process as well. You know, very often funders, again, it will reflect how much money you're being given, but very often funders will want you to evidence how you've used the money and what the impact has been, those sorts of things. So you know, it's important to make sure you've kind of got your processes and procedures in place that you can administer the money, work it properly and all those things and account for it. Similarly, take the evidencing impact seriously. It isn't just a case of bean counting and doing it because the funder wants it. It's much more important for you because you can use the evidence, the case studies, the stories in future applications to show your impact of what you're doing. It's also about providing information in a way which works for you. So, you know, I think it's really important to be able to celebrate with volunteers, staff, trustees, the community, what you've done, and make people feel good about what they've done in their community. You know, video clips on smartphones are such an easy thing to do, that, and you know, that a short film can say what might be a 1 or 2 page case study, and it has life and vitality, which you know is going to get people on your side, I think, without a doubt. Similarly, it's about starting to think about developing PR campaigns, become, what I say here, the funder's darling, not the bitch. So what I mean by that is I've been sort of work with some groups who have, as a result of being able to be picturesque and tell a good story, they're always used by the funders for visits and so forth. And so as a result, you know, their chances of getting more funding definitely are higher, rather than, you know, sort of you being beholden to the funders and having to jump through all the hoops they demand. So think about progression and the next step straight away. So if you do get a grant, and let's say it's one where your long-term aspiration is to grow a community sort of activity or business, think about how you're going to evidence that, but then also think about what the next steps might be. So I mentioned starting off with an awards for all grant, let's say of a few £1,000s, and then moving to reaching communities and, you know, so forth, and develop it in that way. But plan it ahead. Also, you know, there's nothing wrong with you applying for grants and even sometimes applying from the same funder again, but I think it's really important not to have that as your viability approach. I think it's really, really important to make sure that you diversify your funding from as many different sources as you possibly can, and constantly looking to do that. And grow and develop. One of the frustrations I know a lot of bid writers have is that lots of funders will use this word innovative. We want the new thing, we want the new. So, you know, it's important to kind of keep your project fresh, keep it on a trajectory where it's doing things. And because if you're sort of, sometimes groups who are saying, well, all we want to do is the same thing, we just want to carry on with lunch clubs or whatever, that's fine, but there still needs to be that inspiration for the funders. So, you know, do find and try and spend a bit of time thinking about how you make your project still sound fresh and new, because unfortunately that's something lots of funders want to do. So I will sort of just move quickly on to accessing skills. This is just as important, and, you know, I have given you some examples in there of where community groups have accessed skills from sources such as the local authority and so forth. You know, it is certainly possible to go out there and and get some of your skills gaps filled. So for example, being able to get legal, property professionals, business support, sometimes through things called pro bono, which is where, let's say, an architect may offer you some free time with the aspiration, hope that you're then going to purchase some services from them if your project progresses. But you know, first of all, in terms of sources, it's about using your networks, social media, being able to tell stories, make people interested about you, make people aware of you, and make people want to help you as well. That's really, really important. Think about your local authority. Lots of local authorities have shrunk back, as you know, and it may not be so easy to find delegated officers with you know, roles to support community groups, but most local authorities still have got people around in that sense. Similarly, your local councillors, I mean, I know there's a wide range in terms of capability, but certainly I've got lots of examples of councillors actually being very helpful, very supportive, and some areas they're still fortunate enough to have their discretionary budgets in some areas up to £10,000, which they can then allocate to community groups who come forward. So, you know, again, councillors can be a really, really useful source of links and contacts. Similarly, using local CVS volunteer bureaus to tap into to get support and people. So volunteer bureaus, they will have a whole range of approaches for volunteers, and you know, part of their role will be to match you up with them. So you know, again, I'm aware of lots of groups who have been able to attract new trustees or generally volunteers through volunteer bureaus. So you know, it is on there. And there are some specialist kind of opportunities out there too to access skills. So for example, another one is what's it called here? It's volunteer it yourself. Challenges young people aged 14 to 24 to learn trade and employability skills through helping to fix local youth and community facilities in need of essential repairs and improvements. They're still going strong. They're doing lots of activities. They basically then work with Juicens and Homebase and people like that as a way of sort of getting in the tools and the sort of equipment and so forth as well. So you know, there are specialist things like that. There are still, although these are much more patchy now, business in the community. I've still got some around me where they run projects called Pro Help. This is where they actually pair you up with let's say legal people or IT people to help you develop up a new website, that sort of thing, who generally people in business who want to give something and put something back, and you know, where it works, it can work really well. Increasingly, in order to cover their costs, so they will charge something like £125 fixing fee, if you like, but that's only if you find someone suitable and work gets done. So I'd say there are lots of opportunities out there still. Unfortunately, the coverage isn't as great as it used to be. Corporate social responsibility, just in case you're not aware of what that is, that's very much the idea of business wanting to connect and support local community groups and help and support them through staff sessions where they go along and help. So for example, a lot of the banks do education things linked to schools or community groups, and similarly corporate social responsibility could be about providing prizes or sort of even coming along. Again, a group I was recently visiting, they're developing a community garden. They had Linden, who are a reasonably large land builder, come along with some diggers and 2 men and cleared the site for them at no cost, and that took then the best part of 2 days. So you know, lots of businesses have corporate social responsibility as one of their offers, so it's important to look at that. So yeah, volunteers, I've already mentioned about volunteer bureaus and lists and so forth. And of course, one of the other important places in order to kind of get access to skills and information are you. you know, as pioneers, you're on the ground, you're collecting an awful lot of information, and as a result, the odds are you're going to pick up lots which would be really, really helpful to those groups. So, you know, don't underestimate how important people like you are to those groups, particularly the ones which are very small and embryonic. So that's kind of it from me. We've got a few minutes now before it's 7 o'clock. So I don't know, Anna or Steve, I don't know whether there's any questions have come in or any thoughts you've got.
No questions as yet. I've just put a call out to see if anybody's got any last minute questions. There's a few observations coming around our own wellbeing index, which I'll pick up separately because that's much more about that data rather than the kind of main subject of what we're discussing. I had a couple of observations actually. People probably won't know this, but I used to be a director of an independent museum, so I spent an awful long time writing funding bids. And a couple of things you said, Mick, were really brought a lot of painful memories back, particularly around making sure you bid for the right fund. You know, you've read the guidelines, you're making sure that your application fits the criteria. You can waste an awful lot of time preparing the funding bid, and actually you're doing it more out of hope than anything else and trying to force fit your opportunity into the funding scheme and the purpose of that scheme. And I think the other thing is, which I found as well, is that sometimes you're able to get an application through, but you've applied for something that really isn't within the mission of your organisation. So you end up sort of twisting the organisation to deliver something that really is a distraction to what you call mission is, just because you were in search of funding. So you mentioned both those points, and I just thought they were really relevant because I've been there and done it, and you know, have the scars, if you like.
Yeah, it is painful, and it is a learning process, I guess, isn't it, to go through this. And, you know, as I say, the ratios are for a lot of good bid writers 1 in 5. So, and you know, I'm sure you can get that better equally. I know people who've got 100% success rate, so find those people.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing I didn't mention earlier, by the way, is that if people are interested in finding out more about the foundation, the Co-op Foundation's grants and their loan scheme, they just need to go to coopfoundation.org.uk and have a look at the information there. It's really easy to find, and there's guidance there around the sort of both the I Will fund, but also the interest-free loans that are available. So people can find out a lot more detail by going to the website. That was coopfoundation.org.uk. And obviously the other funding stream which we didn't mention, which, you know, pioneers will be very aware of right now, is the local community fund, because currently, you know, we're at the shortlisting stage for this round of applications. We'll be looking for applications again sort of probably late spring of next year for the rounds that will launch in October 2020. And it's always worth sort of, you know, having that in mind whenever you're talking to groups to see if the kind of funding they're looking for has a kind of long enough time window for them to consider applying for the local community fund if it's appropriate. So that's something I should have mentioned earlier, but it's pioneers will be very aware of that given their involvement in the shortlisting exercise that's ongoing at the moment.
Great. Are there any other questions coming? If not, I don't know whether Anna wants to do a bit of a wrap up.
No more questions at this stage.
Okay, so Anna, over to you really in terms of thoughts and next steps.
So thank you for that, Mick. That was really interesting, and it looks like people have found that incredibly useful. So just thank you again from us. I think the only other thing that I can add to what Stephen's already said about the funding is that we do still have the Locality helpline, which is still open and running, and we have our relationship manager over at Locality who can take any specific queries, questions about anything that might be available for specific groups that you might want to signpost them towards. So that's available on coop.co.uk/endangered spaces.
I'll just say actually on that, the person who's delivering that for you, Jeremy, he is an absolute mind of information. He knows everything about everything. So yeah, he's a really good resource.
he's been absolutely fantastic, and every single inquiry that comes through to Jeremy gets a person. It's not a cut and paste job. Every single one gets a thought through, very comprehensive response. So that's a really valuable resource that is being made available to groups, organisations, regardless of what stage they're at in the process of making spaces better and improving them and saving them. So definitely do make use of that service. Do signpost people towards that. I think that's probably all I've got to add on it. Just again, thank you everybody for attending. We'll put the recording onto YouTube as normal, and I think Chris is planning on sending out the reminder link on Friday with that information on. So I think that's it from me, unless there's any other last thoughts from Stephen or Mick.
No, I've just no, we just had a thank you from Brian E. Scott, one of our member pioneer coordinators, just saying great information. So thanks for everybody for taking part tonight, and also thanks to you, Mick, and Anna for setting the scene, and Mick for giving us such really useful and relevant information. Much appreciated.
No worries at all. Take care then,
that
everyone.
That was really informative. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
Bye.